Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the first installment of our Ask an Alumni Expert web series. And so today we will be talking more specifically about wildfire in the face of climate change. My name is Jason Elliott. I'm a graduate from 2014 where I studied with an MEM, MF, and I'm going to be joined today by Toddi Steelman, who, as you probably are aware, is our Dean of the Nicholas School and graduated from the Nicholas School back in 1996 with a PhD. And so without further ado, we're gonna start going through some questions. And if you have any questions that you would like to share with Toddi, please feel free to chat those into the window. Glenda will be helping us provide those questions throughout this series at the end of the session. And are you ready, Toddi?
I am ready if you're ready, Jason.
Great. For alums that haven't quite met you yet and getting to know you, can you share a little bit about your experience from PhD to Dean?
Sure. So I received my PhD in 1996 from the Nicholas School and had a predominant focus on environmental policy. So that's my area, and had written my dissertation on national forest management. So forestry has been a big part of my background, and my initial job was actually here at the Nicholas School. So I got hired as a visiting assistant professor to teach a course on sustainability and social and economic impact assessment out of the starting gate, because my supervisor, Bob Healy, had gone on sabbatical and they needed somebody to cover some of those classes. So I was fortunate enough to start here at the Nicholas School as a visiting assistant professor. And from there, I went out to the University of Colorado at Denver, and was living in Denver and working on land use planning sorts of issues out there, community forestry issues out there, among other sorts of things. Areas that focus on the role of the public and communities in natural resource management and planning. So I spent 4 years out there. And then my husband and I have kind of tag teamed in our careers over the last 25 years. And so it was sort of his turn, and he said, I'd really like to move back to North Carolina. And so I said, great, give me some time to see if I can find an academic position, because those can be a little bit more harder to find than some other positions. And so I was very fortunate enough to find a job at North Carolina State University, and took up a position there in 2001, and was in a position there until 2012 in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. So again, forestry sort of came up, and started teaching courses in environmental policy, adaptive governance and management. I did some work with our undergraduates on internships and career and professional training around that, and started to move into some more administrative work at that time. And then after I finished my work at NC State, I ended up going up to Canada, to the University of Saskatchewan, to take on a position as the founding dean or director of the School for Environment and Sustainability, or SENS. And so that was my first real administrative appointment. And so I spent 5 years there in a really wonderful opportunity to build out that school in terms of hiring a bunch of faculty and, creating what I considered a pretty innovative curriculum. And it was my husband's turn again, and he said that he wanted to move back to North Carolina. So third time's the charm for being in North Carolina. I think it's going to stick this time. And so he got a job back at NC State, and I followed him back down here. And in the meantime, the position for dean came open, and I am the luckiest person in the world to have the best job in the world right now.
Great. We are lucky to have you, and I'm glad that North Carolina keeps bringing people home. I understand that some of your earlier research in your career focused on public participation in natural resource management. What motivated your interest in this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a very personal motivation, mostly because, and anybody who's read some of the rollout material on me will know this, but I was born and raised in West Virginia, and felt like there was a lot of disenfranchisement of local people from a lot of the decision making that went on that related to our natural resources, whether you were in the timber industry, whether you're in the coal mining industry, or some of the other natural resources that are relevant there. And so I think motivated in part to how can you create a stronger sense of voice for local peoples and communities in the destinies that affect them so palpably. So I think that's, and I ended up writing my dissertation on national forest management and making the Monongahela National Forest, which is in West Virginia, the case study investigating exactly that.
Great. So to kind of help us think about it at a high level, what are some of the characteristics of successful public input process?
Sure. So I like to think of public input processes as tools that get us to common interest-oriented solutions, right? We want to serve the common interest. We are a democracy, and we want to serve, probably the common interest that exists out there. So I think about three defining criteria: procedural criteria, pragmatic criteria, and substantive criteria that we want to meet if we're going to serve the common interest. And I think public involvement is part of the procedural criteria. How are we being procedurally fair in how we go about something? But that also has to be weighed against the substantive criteria. Are we considering the substantive issues that are most germane to the issue of the day? And then pragmatically, will it actually work? So I think all three of those things have to be balanced off against each other if we want to find common interested-oriented solutions. And public involvement and those kinds of procedures are one of those pieces that go into making good decisions, I think.
Great. Based on your experience, does the inclusion of a diverse set of stakeholders always lead to the most optimal outcome?
Always is a strong word.
It only sits deal in absolutes.
I'm a scientist, so it's going to be hard to get me to say always, so not always. I think that there are reasons we want to definitely hear from the public, but we also have a lot of expertise that comes outside of just with the public. So you can think of substantive matter experts that I think have input that are really important to hear from. I think the public also, we have local expertise, we have traditional knowledge expertise, we have public sentiment that also has to be part of the mix. So I think there are different kinds of inputs that become important depending on the kind of decision. And again, I would reflect back on our democratic ideals we have as a society at large and the importance of procedural justice and those other sort of pieces for finding outcomes that probably do serve those common interests. So I think that it's a necessary, but perhaps not always sufficient condition for having good decision.
Great. We're going to now shift a little bit more to specifically wildfire. And so one of the more interesting aspects of wildfire or any natural disaster is that it doesn't care about geopolitical boundaries.
For sure.
And so that requires individuals from different state level, county level, city level, broader international level decision making. And so since a lot of your research recently has been on incident response to these kind of disasters, can you talk about some of your key findings of how this actually works out on the ground?
Sure. It's messy. So that's a wonderful question. So thank you for the opportunity to even address it. So when you have a large scale disaster, you're starting from a standpoint of, say, a local jurisdiction that is probably going to get overwhelmed in some way, like whatever it is that they're facing, whether, it's a fire in the case of what I and the research team that I work with study, or the floods, for instance, that are facing the Midwest right now. You have a local response that gets overwhelmed at some point. And once that local response is overwhelmed, they sort of hold up their hand, cry uncle, and say, send somebody in to help me, right? And so that becomes an opportunity basically for the local response to integrate with an extra local response, and to try to make things go as safely, as effectively as possible, so you reduce the chance of loss of life and loss of the values that people really care about wherever they are. And so
this meeting is being recorded.
That's done under conditions of utter chaos, especially in a fire. So what our research team studies is how do we do that integration between the local and extra local response as best as possible. And of course, as fires have gotten larger over time, and we're definitely seeing a trend where fires get larger over time, those fires, as you said, do not respect political boundaries. They don't care. And so you've got a locality that's been affected.
This meeting is no longer being recorded.
State level lands. It may bleed into federal level lands, whether that's the National Park Service or National Wildlife Service or U.S. Forest Service, Department of Defense lands, Bureau of Indian Affairs. All of a sudden, you've got a really big mix of characters and nonprofit organizations and relief organizations that are trying to coordinate together. And so that becomes very challenging. And that's what we try to do is the work, what our research suggests is if you've done some good work ahead of the fire to build those relationships, it's going to go much easier during the fire to coordinate during those times of utter chaos. So that's what we study, and it's various dimensions of how to sort of rock that kind of integration.
That's definitely not easy. You're a dean, and there's very similar work that is probably done in terms of the various politics that happen here in the locality of the Nick School, but compared to the broader institution of Duke University.
Sure.
So I'm sure that has set you up very well to deal with some of those
Well,
issues.
you know, we study complex organizational stuff. And so, yeah, the universities are equally complex organizations, whether you think about, okay, we're the Nicholas School, but we have 3 divisions, and then we have an undergraduate program, we have a professional master's program, we have a PhD program, we have alumni, we have a board of visitors, right? So there are lots of different constituencies, all of whom have very valid substantive, procedural, and pragmatic concerns, right? If we get back to those decision-making criteria. So, you know, as a dean, and given some of the experience I've had, not only in wildfire, but in decision-making at large, I do feel it's been a very nice crucible in which to gain a lot of experience. And then you think about Duke at large, the city and county of Durham, the state, and you know, and you continue to scope it out, right, in terms of where we want to have impact and how we do that effectively.
Can you discuss some of the causes or drivers of the increasingly devastating fires we've been seeing, particularly in Western United States recently?
Absolutely. So, you know, we wouldn't care so much about wildfires in so much as, you know, if they didn't affect things that we care about, we wouldn't care about them so much, right? So the issue is that fires are now occurring in places where they really affect human communities, or something we call the wildland urban interface, or WUI, which is fun to say. So the WUI is where people and forests meet, and we have more fires that occur sort of in that particular area. So when people are affected, we care a lot more. So one is the growing presence of the wildland urban interface. So beginning in the late 80s, and as our baby boomers started to increase and move towards retirement age and looking at, you know, fun places to retire and having lots of disposable income, they started moving west. And so moving into these beautiful places, buying cabins, inhabiting these areas. And so all of a sudden, basically what you have are a lot of people moving into areas that hadn't been there before. That's coupled with a history of forest management that has been underfunded for quite some time. And so the ability to get in and do work that would reduce the amount of trees in some cases and vegetation that we have on some of our national forest lands, do some timbering, creates what we call increased vegetative load or fuel loading that sets us up for bigger fires. Also, we have a history of management doing suppression on our federal lands and other places for quite some time, which basically means whenever we have a fire, we had a 10 a.m. policy that started, you know, decades ago that basically said we try to put out every fire by 10 a.m. in the morning. Now we've abandoned that policy, but that legacy lives on basically under the general guise of the public believes that we should just go and put every fire out. Well, if you go and put every fire out, that means fire is not playing its natural ecological role in the landscape, and it allows it to get out and sort of burn down some of that fuel loading, the vegetative loading, and allowing fire to play its natural role in the landscape. So that just means more fuel is out there, coupled with the fuel that we haven't been dealing with, if you think about it that way, in terms of forest management. So you've got preconditions where you've got a lot of fuel, you've got people who live in the way of it, and then you've got climate change. So that's sort of the additional piece. So with climate change, what we end up with are hotter temperatures that contribute to more drying of that vegetation, lower humidities, greater winds. So you get hot, dry, windy, which are the preconditions that we need basically for big fires. So you've got the fuel, you've got the conditions, and you've got people that are going to be affected. So there you go.
You've touched on some of these just with your recent response, but what do you think are some of the biggest limitations to effective fire management in the U.S. today?
I think in part, people don't understand that fire is a natural ecological process, and that we need fire to actually have healthy forests and healthy critters in our forest, and a healthy relationship with our forest in general. So I think that's hard to get people to see fire as something other than something that's bad. the Smokey the Bear campaign, Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires, has been incredibly effective. So, but fire does play a really important role in our ecosystem. So I think helping people understand that is an impediment to understanding the role that fire can play on the landscape. So when we do have a big fire burning, sometimes allowing it to play that natural role is a really cost-effective way of dealing with the problem that we have. So that's one aspect. I think the other aspect is that increasingly, because we have these very large, very severe, very intense fires, people don't understand that there's very little that we can actually do in the scale and scope of these very large fires. So just like we don't have hurricane fighters, we don't have tornado fighters, we don't have earthquake fighters, but we have firefighters, right? And I think that comes from a time when fires were smaller, and their footprints were more manageable, as opposed to now when we have these very large, very intense fires that approach the kind of natural disasters equivalent to a tornado, a hurricane, an earthquake, where we can't do a whole lot to prevent it or to stop it, just given the scale and scope of it. But we've set ourselves up socially with our firefighters and others to believe that that's something we can do. And so that's really hard with the public sometimes. So if you've got a large fire, they don't understand if we fly a plane, it's really not going to have an impact if we drop retardant somewhere. Or if we go out and we dig a 10-mile dozer line, it's really not going to make a difference. If we don't have firefighters out on the fire line, people get upset, but all we're doing is putting them in harm's way, knowing that really they aren't going to have an impact. And so that sets us up for a lot of conflict with the public when you're on these large campaigns in terms of what is feasible and what's not feasible, given preconditions and ideas that people believe.
That's a very interesting distinction that I never actually pieced together, but it makes so much sense. So that's part of the story that I'm going to be telling from now on.
Good.
So based on your experience of being out at some of the fires out west, how has the recent fires demonstrated new fire behavior that we have not yet seen before, such as like fire tornadoes, which sounds terrifying to me. So.
Sure. So, I'm going to ask a question back to you, Jason, which is, and you're not a fire expert, and I don't have any, expectation that you would have this, but you see fires in the summer, right? On the news media and other sorts of things. What's your impression for what you're seeing now versus what you would have seen 5 years ago and what's happening?
And so I'm from northern Indiana. We have cornfields. We don't have large fuel loads. And so I didn't grow up around fire. But seeing some of the more recent coverage of a mountain on fire as cars are driving through it, I'm just like, I would not live there. That's just like, does not make sense to me. Same way somebody might look at some of our massive flooding that we've been having here. And so 5 years ago, as I was leaving the Nick school, I understood this is, textbook, this is what we need to be doing. But when you start actually working it in real life, you have to start taking into account all of these people influences, which tend to speak much more loudly than the ecological environment saying, I need this to rebirth by getting new trees into the area. And so it's been one of the more interesting things to actually see how people react more publicly. When I was a student, I was just reading a textbook. So that's been a big change for me over the 5 years.
Yeah. So, I think that, your question is sort of like, how is fire changing on the ground in terms of like the fire tornado that you referenced that was on the Carr fire last summer, out of the, the Carr fire just south of the Mendocino complex last summer. So our research team was on the Ferguson fire at the time that took place. And so we were in California in Yosemite Valley on a fire, and we had heard about the fire tornado that took place. And it was really sobering, in part because the work that we do on our fires, we embed ourselves with the incident management teams that are out managing. So just like a journalist embeds themselves in, as a war correspondent sort of out with people in a war zone, we embed ourselves with those incident management teams and follow them around, job shadow them to sort of understand how they're making real-time decisions as everything is unfolding, given the complexities that they are dealing with. And I was standing there with one of the incident commanders in a meeting, and you know, this is a guy who has a very formidable presence. He's 7'1", and so he was looking down at me, and he just sort of said, shaking his head, he was like, "We don't have any slides in our deck to deal with that." And what he was basically saying is that, you know, as somebody with a 30 to 35 year experience managing fire, he has a slide deck that he goes to when he experiences certain situations that he references to help him figure out what he needs to do given that particular context. And then he doesn't have anything in his deck that's prepared him to deal with a fire tornado. Now, it is not uncommon for us to have fire whirls on a fire, which are something that might be the size of, you know, half this room, or, you know, 10 feet in diameter or something like that. The car fire, the tornado there, was something that was, you know, 160 miles an hour over 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. It was almost 7 miles tall, and just humongous. I mean, so we know from earth sciences that there have been fire tornadoes on the earth before, that we have seen them. But to see one and have it captured on a fire like this is something that is really new. And it gets back to that point, like, there is nothing we can do to stop that. We can't put a plane in the air. We can't build a dozer line. We can't put firefighters in front of it, because we're just setting all of those individuals up for disaster themselves. We're putting people in harm's way. And so the risk-benefit ratio really doesn't work out. So it gets back to sort of conveying some of this. You know, the other thing that we're seeing is that the rates of spread, so that's a measurement that we have for how fast a fire moves, the rates of spread are increasing. And that's also very sobering, because we have fires that just grow overnight that make it really hard to do the kind of standard planning that we have traditionally seen. We think that we can get a foothold on it on this ridge, but it turns out it's already burned 3 ridges past that. So the kind of planning we can do has to adjust as well. And bringing the public along with us in terms of, you know, the real-time learning that our fire managers are doing is a real challenge. Because the public wants to see the firefighters there, protecting them, helping them, taking care of them, when the fire managers are adapting to this new reality and the severity of the conditions that they're dealing with as well.
Gotcha. So, fun fact, when I was at the Nick school, I did a summer internship with the Nature Conservancy working on fire weather.
Okay.
And so I got to wear the ultra fashionable fire gear, which is actually not fashionable at all, nor comfortable. But one of the things that our goal was is to look at how do we enable our state of North Carolina to more readily have controlled burns.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is dictated by the weather policies, saying it needs to be this humidity or this type of mixing height or this wind speed going to this direction. And so if you were talking to a policymaker, whether state or federal or local, about how to improve the way that we react to fire, what kind of things would you ask them to put a bill in place for?
Yeah, so I think the more fire we can get on the ground outside of fire season, the better it is for us. Because that's putting fire back into its natural role in the ecosystem. And there are many, many good benefits that come with that. So the more of that kind of burning we can do, the better it is for us. One of the frustrations about this year, for instance, was the government shutdown occurred right during that window when we do a lot of that prescribed burning. Not only here in the East, in the South, and in the West. So that's going to have consequences for us come this fire season in terms of the amount of work that didn't get done. So our ability to continue to do that kind of work is absolutely essential. The South has a very proud and long tradition of doing more prescribed burning than any other place in the United States. And it's a tradition that's been kept alive here more so than other places. And we have people here that do the absolute best job possible. We do training for everywhere else. I'm very happy to say that it is a tradition that is now growing nationally in terms of interest in prescribed fire and desire to put more fire on the land, and perhaps most importantly, building the capacity of the people to do it. Because you can imagine, if you're a homeowner and I come along and say, hey, I got this drip torch, I'd like to light up your, you know, the property across from where you live, you might be like, hey, brother or sister, hang on there for a second. Let's talk this through. Right? So we're building the capacity of the people that do that burning. And as you can imagine, the capacity of the people that do that burning is not just the technical expertise, but the ability to work and play well with others to make the case for why we need to get that done. So it's an interesting kind of combined skill set that you need for that kind of work. If we're going to do more work, not only in North Carolina or throughout the South, air quality regulations are really important. Do we have exemptions that allow us to do some prescribed burning under the right condition, which you just mentioned, where we know we're going to get a column that's going to carry the smoke up high, so it's not going to be impacting our populations on the ground. So that's really important. Liability is a big issue in terms of who assumes the liability for a prescribed fire. So who will help us sort of understand that if something goes terribly wrong, and those instances are very few and far between, but they do happen, how do we deal with those issues? And then I think the last thing is just how do we make the continued opportunities available for building that capacity? And sometimes that comes with additional funding that allows the groups and the organizations, just like the Nature Conservancy, continuing to do that work.
Great. So that's the end of my list of questions. And now we want to hear from you. And so if you have any questions that you've chatted in, Glenda will now share those with us.
Thank you, Jason and Dean Steelman. We have a question from Cody Harrison, who asks, something I've only heard mentioned once in relation to more severe fires is reduction in wild herbivore populations. To what extent do you think this is impacting fuel load and thus fire severity? And he also adds 7 miles tall.
7 miles tall, I think that might be in reference to the Car Fire tornado, maybe? Okay, yeah. So I think what you're asking is, as we get more vegetation growing up, it's really hard for our larger mammals or herbivores, whether, we're talking about moose, whether we're talking about deer or other critters, basically, there's no room for them left there to forage, right? And so I think that this is not my area of research, so I'm going to qualify it by saying this, but what I hear when I go to conferences is, yeah, there is an impact, and I know that I did some work out in New Mexico and in Colorado where, and these were with some traditional Hispanic communities in northern New Mexico, where they have traditional communal lands and were interested in doing a lot more they were interested in doing prescribed burning, reducing the vegetation so that their deer populations would basically come back. And I know that from their experiences, that's exactly what they found, because once you reduce that dense understory, you open up the canopy a little bit, you are producing more forage for the critters to come back. And they see it as being safer as well, because they can see further. So as in predator-prey relationships, they are not quite as scared to get into that underbrush because they know what's coming after them. At least they can see around. At least that's what they were telling me.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Keiki Worthington, who asks, Smokey the Bear was obviously very effective, as Toddi mentioned. Are there new marketing or PR efforts in place to replace that in public opinion?
Hi, Keiki. I'm so glad you're tuning in. That is a wonderful question, and the answer to that is, the direct answer to that is not really. So the Forest Service finds itself in an interesting position where it can't be a policy advocate because it is a federal agency. And so switching from what has been a long-term campaign of only you prevent forest fires, which sort of has been around for quite some time, to advocating for something else becomes actually a sticky issue, as I understand it, for the Forest Service. Now, there have been efforts on other nonprofit organizations, for instance, like the Nature Conservancy, to hold up other critters who are fire-loving critters, to sort of say, now I'm going to blank on it. I wish I could remember the names of it. I can't right now, but it's like somebody quail, or who you need to burn off the underbrush for the quail to thrive, or something like that. So there have been efforts around that, but nothing near as wholesale as you've ever seen with Smokey the Bear. And so in part because, man, that is a campaign that got a ton of traction and has just had really, terrific staying power. So I don't think we have a counter campaign that has ever sort of achieved the same or a comparable level of competitiveness with Smokey the Bear. And I think hope springs eternal. I know that I've been involved in a couple of different conversations to try to figure out what the messaging could possibly be. And even that messaging is really challenging because, you get into good fire and you get into bad fire. Not all fire is good, but then how do you parse for the public what is good fire? And so the messaging becomes really quite challenging. So Keiki, if you have any ideas, I'm all ears. Thank you for the question.
We have another question from Kim. As someone who follows these issues closely, what, if any, effect do you think PG&E's very public Chapter 11 bankruptcy announcement and CEO step down will have on our collective will to invest and collaborate on mega fire prevention?
Great question. If that's Kim Batchelder, hey Kim, thank you for the question. So the case study of PG&E is a fascinating one and one that I am indeed following very, very closely. So this is perhaps the first case of a climate, change bankruptcy in the country. I've heard that said. I don't know if it's actually true, but I've heard it mentioned a couple of different times. So, it's a case of where there are so many claims that have been made against PG&E. Basically, it's moved them into bankruptcy. So what are the consequences basically for PG&E and for us and how we think about fire into the future? Well, I think it's a huge wake-up call for not just utilities, but other entities that can be affected by climate change, that you can have a scale and scope of disaster that can basically cause enormous harm to your financial bottom line. And therefore, one might want to begin thinking boards of directors and shareholders might want to be thinking a lot more strategically about the threats of climate change and what they can pose to the bottom line of a utility, a corporation, or something else. So I think it's a punctuation point in our collective conceptualization of how to think about climate change and the consequences. So a lot of us think about whether we're paying for climate change or not. This is a great example to demonstrate that we are all going to end up paying for climate change in one way or the other. So ratepayers are going to end up paying more. PG&E has already asked for rate increases, basically, in bankruptcy, which they can. Shareholders will end up paying more. Ironically, solar energy and wind energy folks who had contracts with PG&E will end up paying more because under bankruptcy, PG&E can now come back and renegotiate those contracts. So you think about the cascading effects that a bankruptcy will have of this scale and magnitude and who ends up paying the bill. And we all are going to end up absorbing that cost in some sort of meaningful way. So I think it's something that we need to continue to pay attention to. I think that corporations need to be aware, and their boards need to be more aware of the consequences that these sorts of things can have, and that we as the public need to be demanding better action, on climate resiliency from our infrastructure. And I'll pivot from that, even though we're just talking about fire, to look at what's happening in the Midwest right now with the flooding and the infrastructure that's taking a beating there. Billions upon billions of dollars of infrastructure need to be rebuilt now based on the flooding that's happening in Nebraska all the way down through Mississippi. And how are we thinking about resiliency in that context? So just like the flooding, just like the fires, we need to kick it up a huge notch in terms of how we think about resiliency in the face of climate.
We have Brandon Semel. You mentioned the growing urban wildland interface as being one of the key pieces to increasing the risk and damage posed by wildfires. How much are people discussing changing zoning and development in these areas? Sorry, 1 second. Zoning Sorry, Brian, I lost your question. Give me 1 moment.
I could pick it up from there.
Okay.
And when you get there, just chime in with the rest of it. So zoning is, of course, a big issue. You got it?
Found it.
Okay.
How much are people discussing changing zoning and development in these areas? Is there the political willpower to make drastic changes in this area?
That is a wonderful question too, and the short answer is in some cases yes, and in other cases no. So you'll have zoning as an option in places that actually have active land use planning. And in the places that don't have active land use planning, say county or county jurisdictions, you have fewer levers to push, right? But if you've got places where you've got a planning commission and you have active zoning, then there's a chance to actually have that conversation. The challenge that we have is that the incentives are not necessarily well aligned for taking some of that action. So for instance, if you're a municipality and you have the opportunity to build in the wildland urban interface, your incentive is to allow those building permits to go forward. And as a real estate agent, you want to sell in that area because it generates, more land use taxes for the municipality, and everybody wants those land use taxes, or, those local property taxes basically, because that's what funds the local municipality, right? Often when you have a disaster of that scale, say like we just saw on the campfire in Paradise, you have a federal entity that comes in, basically does a lot of the response. You have FEMA monies that come in and help after disaster. So in part, it's subsidizing the risk that the locality is taking, both in response and in recovery. Now, that's not to say that federal subsidy is going to come anywhere near covering the entirety of the loss. I'm not saying that, but we are subsidizing in some ways the ability for people to continue to build in the wildland urban interface. You are starting to see insurance companies get more proactive in terms of where they are going to insure people or not. After the Paradise disaster, the campfire disaster, we're seeing insurance companies starting to pull out of certain areas and, elect not to insure properties. So that puts the decision back on the homeowner as to whether or not to rebuild in a certain area or not. I will draw your attention that there are very big equity and distributional consequences to this, because rich people can afford to rebuild. Poor people either didn't have insurance to begin with, or don't have any other option to buy property somewhere else to rebuild. And of course, I think there are disproportionate impacts on, usually, at least in the West, the Latino population and underrepresented minorities in terms of where people end up living sometimes. So there are big questions related to housing, just like in any place, and it also plays into how we think about fire and protecting ourselves from fire. Land use management and zoning planning are certainly tools that we have in our toolkit. I wish they were used more often, and I wish they were used in conjunction with how we also think about affordable housing in general, so that we're not just thinking about where rich people can build or continue to build as well.
Okay, thank you. Kendall Delicer asks, given our trends of more frequent and severe fires and the associated carbon emissions from these fires, what do you suggest we do about fire to not jeopardize our progress toward climate/carbon sequestration goals?
Excellent. Hi, Kendall. Thanks for the question. And yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, in terms of how do we think about carbon budgets in light of wildfire? So I think that the challenge with fire is that it's going to happen sooner or it's going to happen later. And there's a lot of research being done now related to how much carbon is released depending on the intensity of the fire. If the fire, like we're doing prescribed fire, the amount of carbon that is increased may be less than if we have a hard running, more severe fire. I am not up on that research. I just know that it's happening. But I think that's a provocative way for us to think about the carbon impact. If we know that it's going to happen sooner versus later, and we have some control over the intensity of fire and how it's going to take place, if it can burn less intensely, then perhaps that lessens the carbon footprint than if it burns more intensely. like I said, I only know that that research is going on. Chances are it's very regionally determined in terms of what the consequences are, and I can't speak to it more than that, but I think that's kind of how I'm framing that question in general, in my own head, to think about it.
Okay. A couple more.
I think we have one more question. Yep.
Okay. Sorry, everyone, I couldn't get to your questions. This question comes from Rebecca Beavers. How can physical and social scientists become more involved in incident response at the local and national levels? By involvement, I'm thinking of two paths. One, as a member of an incident management team, to be a part of the decision-making on the ground, response and recovery team. And two, as an evaluator of the incident command, unified command process, as you were with your research.
Wow, great question, Becca. Awesome to hear from you on that front. For those of you that don't know, Becca is a member of an incident management team, and she participates actively in these processes, and she's awesome. So I think the area, the opportunities for like folks that are graduates in the Nicholas schools to be resource advisors. We need that's called a READ, an READ, resource advisor on an incident management team. That's one of the roles that Becca plays on her team. We need people with that kind of subject matter expertise out on the ground to aid the other folks that have their that are doing the work on incident management teams, so they understand the consequences of the decision they're making. If you're putting in a dozer line, if you have to go out and take out a bunch of trees, if you are going to do work in a culturally sensitive area, what are the consequences to the soil, to the water, to the critters that are in those areas? Those teams need that advice, and so there is a real role for folks who graduate with degrees from the Nicholas School to get involved in disaster management, response management in that very way. Thanks for the question.
Okay, that will be it for today. I appreciate everybody who participated. Glenda let me know that 55 of you registered from all across the United States, which I think is fantastic. So thank you for your involvement. Keep an eye out for these future iterations of this exact type of talk, which might be coming to a city near you, and we might need your help. So if you get an email from Glenda, there it is. Lastly, I invite you to visit the Nick School Alumni Development page to learn more about how you can engage with their new program, the Go, Grow, and Give. We'll send a link out in a following email asking for your thoughts on the session and everything. But other than that, thank you so much. And thank you, Toddi, for joining today.
Thank you, Jason. You did a great job. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yeah.